Out of Egypt have I called my son. Matthew chapter 2.
Good evening, brothers and sisters and young people. Well, it's the gospel of the King, isn't it? Matthew. And of course, when we went through Matthew chapter 1, that was very, very much the obvious theme, wasn't it? As you notice, we went through that first chapter, and Matthew was careful, wasn't he, to trace the genealogy through the kings. And of course, in particular, to focus upon David the king. And just, I suppose, as the best summary we could give of chapter 1, brethren and sisters, is that when you come to the promises made to David, never ever before that or after that in the Old Testament was it made so plain, so absolutely plain, that the king that was to come was to be not only David's son, but the Son of God. And Nathan the prophet could not have made that plainer to David, when he said that of his own bowels God would raise up the Son. Almost crude language to tell him he would come out of his body, and in the next breath said on behalf of God that I will be his father. Couldn't have got it plainer than that. And so David understood, brethren and sisters, that though one would be born in his nature to have to die, he would rise from the dead to become the Son of God, determined so by the resurrection of the dead. And you find the arguments in the Old Testament all over the place about David's understanding of that. And Paul summarized it when he said that he was made of the seed of David according to the flesh, but determined to be the Son of God by the resurrection of the dead. And so Matthew presents it that way. Here he is in the line of the kings. And then we get, don't we, brothers and sisters, the fact that he would be born of that virgin. The absolute necessity for that virgin birth to fulfill the promises to David, and that he might save his people from their sins, that he might be called Emmanuel. And of course in that name, which is given in Isaiah's prophecy, we find the title Ale, power with us. Power with us. And Paul argues, doesn't he, that I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. And that power came per medium of the fact that this son of David was born of God. And had he not been born of God, brothers and sisters, he could never have lived that perfect life that he did. And just while I'm on that, just always remember that. It's an amazing thing to me that in our dissertations on the atonement, we lay such great stress upon crucifixion of flesh. And that's right. I'm not arguing about that. It's true. But brethren and sisters, the power of the atonement lies in the fact that that man lived a perfect life. And you could have had 100 people crucified and testified to the weakness of the flesh. 100 people could have demonstrated on the cross the righteousness of God in condemning the nature we bear as being unworthy of perpetuation. But there was only one man ever that lived a perfect life. And had that not been done, all the negative condemnation of flesh would have availed nothing. Because that's what made the difference. A perfect God can accept nothing less than perfection. His own nature demands that. And if one of our race had not come to live that life, brothers and sisters, we would never ever have any chance at all of living eternally. And therein lies the power of the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, born as he was of a virgin in the line of David. Now chapter 2 opens up. And it opens up with these words. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Now we know he was born in Bethlehem of Judea. But why is Matthew so careful to say that like he does? But you see, because there were two Bethlehems, of course. We won't turn the reference up, but in Joshua 19 and verse 15, there was a Bethlehem in Zebulun, way up there in Galilee. So there was another Bethlehem. And Matthew, of course, in referring here to the prophecy of Micah, wants everybody to understand that it's the one in Judea that he's talking about. He wants to discriminate between the one that was in Zebulun. And it wasn't only because of the geographical reasons, brethren and sisters, but because that's where David's house was. That's where David's family lived, in Bethlehem, as we read in the 1st of Samuel 16, verse 1 and verse 18. That's where the house of Jesse lived, in Bethlehem of Judea. And so it's not so much saying, well, don't get it mixed up with one in Zebulun. The point being made is it has to be David's city, because this is all about the king who would be descended from David. Bethlehem, the house of bread. Dramatically portrayed as the house of bread, brothers and sisters, when Elimelech took his family, Naomi and his sons, and went away, didn't he, into the house of Moab, and she came back destitute, and they went away because it lacked bread in Bethlehem. So they thought. But circumstances brought that woman back to the house of bread. And here, of course, there's a specific import upon that name when it comes to the Lord Jesus Christ, because here comes the bread from heaven. Now, all this happened, says Matthew, in the days of Herod the king. I want you to notice that he says that a couple of times about Herod, verse 3, when Herod the king, and notice the emphasis on that, that's not for nothing. And this, brothers and sisters, is the one that was known as Herod the Great. Of course, Herod was a title, it wasn't a name. It really means heroic. That's what Herod means. It means a family of heroics. And this is the one known as Herod the Great. He's the father of this particular family that ruled over Judea. Dreadful family, brothers and sisters. He ruled from about BC 37 up until about when Jesus was born. It wasn't long after this that he died. A more wicked, mad, crazy, cruel and superstitious man you could hardly ever conceive could have been born among men. There was public rejoicing when he died. He was a curse upon mankind, brothers and sisters. He was not only cruel, but he was absolutely paranoia, was this man, about anyone wanting to assassinate him. He was always looking over his shoulder. He was totally paranoia about it. His whole life was made up of putting people to death, right, left and centre, at the least suspicion of anyone who he thought might dethrone him. As a matter of fact, he married 10 women. One of them was a Maccabean princess, Marianne. And he even had her put to death, and then had horrendous nightmares because it haunted him that he killed this woman because he thought that she was plotting against him. And he killed her 2 children because he thought that they were plotting against him. It's no surprise in history that this man put to death those children in Bethlehem. That would be absolutely typical of him. He built fortresses all over the place. In Jerusalem, over in towards Jordan, Machaerus, down Herodian, down south by Hebron. He had fortresses everywhere. Everywhere he went, he locked himself in because he was absolutely paranoia about being assassinated. He was a man that had tremendous ambition, but lived a life, brothers and sisters, of fear and trepidation all his life, and suspicion, and finally died of a dreadful disease. A terrible, debilitating disease that took his life in agony. And that was the man who was known as Herod the Great. And he's called the king. Matthew doesn't say that for nothing, because he's telling us that as soon as this news comes, there's a king born, wow, this man, he would be immediately up on his high horse. The paranoia about that was enormous. Who's this king? Where is he? What's he going to do? And at all costs, he's got to find out where this king is, because he's got to get rid of him at all costs. That would be absolutely typical of Herod the king. You know, brothers and sisters, he was the man that was on the throne, wasn't he? And while he was there, Herod the Great, these wise men came from the east. Now, it's only Matthew who records the visit of the wise men. And it's extraordinary, you know, that in Matthew's Gospel, which we know is Hebraic in atmosphere, as we might say, in tone, that he's very much a Hebrew, speaking from a Hebrew point of view. It's Matthew that several times in his Gospel record gives us a clear indication that God's purpose is with all men. And it's extraordinary that he is the one that introduces the visit of these wise men, who, it says, came from the east. Now, who are they? Well, the word magos, M-A-G-O-S, or magi as some call it, is the word for wise here. We get, from the English, we get magician out of that. And, you know, the word, when you trace it through history, because the etymology of the word is not easy to trace, but as it's used in history, it had a twofold use. It changed over the years. But originally, brothers and sisters, that word was, or that title rather, of the magi was given to Chaldean scientists and astrologers. It was really a noble title, a title only afforded to the learned, among those who could read the stars and the signs of the heavens and other scientific data with which they were familiar. And to be a magi in those words was, of course, to be somebody who was highly respected and admired. Later on in history, it lost some of that gloss, and when it came to Roman and Greek times, the word had somewhat of a looser use and got used of all the charlatans, the magicians as we would know them. We would know them to all be tricksters, and the word fell into disuse like that. So you got Elymas the sorcerer, for example, in Acts of the Apostles. Twice that word is used of him. But it's the original title, I believe, that applied to these men. Obviously so. Because this is no charlatan. They're no charlatans. They're not coming here because of any tricks. God led them here. And these men had come from far, brothers and sisters, because they believed that something in Judea was great, was happening. The King of the Jews had been born. So these were the men who understood. Now, who were they? Who were these magi? Well, we've only got that word in the Bible, that is in the Old Testament, only in a couple of places. And it's in Jeremiah 39. I'd like you to have a look at this one because I really think we ought to try and identify these people. Here we have it, the only place we've got it. And it concerns, of course, the siege of Jerusalem in the days of Jeremiah Jeremiah the prophet, rather. And in the 39th chapter of Jeremiah's prophecy, we read in verse 3, "And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, even Nergal-Sharezer, Samgar-Nebo, Sarseskim, Rabsaris, Nergal-Sharezer, and Rab-Mag." Now there is our word, magi. That's the only place, along with verse 13, where you read those titles again, that's the only time you're going to come across that term in its Chaldean form. So that's the only lead we've got, is those two verses. Rab-Mag. Rab meaning chief, by the way. Rab meaning chief, and Mag meaning magician. So among the delegation of Babylonians who came and sat in Jerusalem to discuss terms of surrender was this chief magi. That's the only use of the term we've got. So we understand, therefore, that they had associations at least with Babylon. Herodotus, who was, of course, an ecclesiastical historian of those times, wrote of those times, he says that later on that was a title, the magi was a title later on which was given to the Medo-Persians and to the priesthood of the Medo-Persians. And there is abundant evidence that it was used in the times of the Medo-Persians. So it would seem to indicate, quite clearly at least, that these people came from somewhere near the Fertile Crescent, at the top of the Gulf of Persia, where Babylon and Medo-Persia were. And that they were, in those days, respected scientists, whose views were respected, and they were not looked upon as later on the Romans and the Greeks saw that title for the magicians, the charlatans, of course, the tricksters. That was not the case here. Now, this is obviously where the wise men came from. But why did they come from there? Well, you see, if you'll turn over the book of Daniel, you see, Daniel was over there, brethren and sisters. Daniel was over there for a considerable part of his life and had enormous influence upon these people. Now, this word we're going to come across here now is not the word magi, but it has the same idea that the word magi does. And here is Daniel in Babylon. And he's described in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 11 that there is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father, that is the days of Nebuchadnezzar, because he's talking to Belshazzar, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians. The same idea is behind that word, though it's not magi. Astrologers, Chaldeans and soothsayers. So Daniel was the master of them. Now, what we know about Daniel, brethren and sisters, we'd be absolutely certain that whoever Daniel came in contact with got to hear about the truth, wouldn't they? We no doubt about that at all. And it's clearly obvious that these magicians, these magi, were grounded in these things by Daniel, who lived for many years in Babylon and who was greatly respected among that class of people. So that, I believe, is the origin of the Magi. Now Matthew says they came from the east. Now it's interesting. But you do have reference in the Old Testament to a people known in the, if we're quoting the Hebrew, we'd use the expression Ben Kedem, the Ben Kedem, which in the book of Judges and in other places, but in Judges in particular, it's used several times. It's expressed as the children of the east. Ben, you see, sons or children. Kedem, the east. Children of the east, the Ben Kedem. That was a title of nomadic tribes that roved over the Arabian Peninsula and over towards Persia. The people who inhabited those regions east of the land became known as the Ben Kedem, the children of the east, which would have incorporated, of course, these Magi. And it's interesting to find out who some of them were. Jethro was one of those Ben Kedem. Because you see, where did they come from? Where did these children of the east originate from? Many of them, that is. Not all of them, but many of them. Where did they originate from? Well, they came from Abraham. Now, we're not turning these references up because of our time factor, but, you know, you go back to Genesis 25, when later in life Abraham married Keturah, and through her he had some sons, but he didn't want them to be mixed up with Isaac and to spoil Isaac's inheritance. And it says in the record that he sent them into the east country. And one of those boys was Midian. And Jethro, of course, was the priest of Midian. And he was from the east country. Another one of those personalities that came from the east country was Job. Remember? At the opening of the opening sentence of Job points out that he was a greatly respected man among the children of the east. So Job lived in that direction many, many years ago, of course, early in the history of the Scripture. And another character, you know, who was one of the children of the east was Balaam, who, though we know was a false prophet, and of course was drawn away by the wages of unrighteousness, yet he knew the truth. God used him to announce some amazing prophecies, one of which brought those Magi to Jerusalem, as we'll see as we go on through Matthew. So you see, it's not as if these men came out of nowhere. They were not that they were completely ignorant and just saw a brilliant star and took a guess that it might be something important. Here were people who had some relationship to the truth, who were descendants of those who were taught, I believe, by Daniel, and were influenced by others, notable men. There's a suggestion that some of the characters mentioned in the book of Proverbs came from the children of the east. Jacob, the son of Agar, and so forth, the wise man of Proverbs 30, it is said, was the child of the east. And so this is where they came from. And right over there, brothers and sisters, way over there, towards the east, was a group of people who knew more about the King of the Jews than the Jews themselves. That's the point that Matthew's making. That's the point that Matthew is making. And so when we come back to Matthew chapter 2 then, this is not being recorded as a matter of curiosity. Matthew's making the point that here were a people that were interested in the King of the Jews when the Jews were not interested in their own king, who didn't know him. That's the point that Matthew is making. Now verse 2 says, these men turned up in Jerusalem saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? Now, you'll never understand that verse, brothers and sisters, unless you make a mental picture of it. Now, you just imagine, in Jerusalem. Now, rumour is rife everywhere in Jerusalem about the coming of Messiah. There were the older people, the Annas and the Simeons and so forth, the Zachariases and the Elizabeths. There were the older people who were reading the prophets and understanding that the time was near. There was an air of expectancy. And here comes people way over there whose culture and background is totally different. And when the vast population, apart from the older people, when the vast population of Jewry was in ignorance, turning up in the streets of Jerusalem and saying, "Where is the King of the Jews?" What? The King of the Jews? People would say, "Who would you say?" And that would run through that city like electricity. "Hey, have you heard about these people? They're looking for the King of the Jews." And there'd be other things, brothers and sisters, that would startle them. You see, when we look at the title, the King of the Jews, you know, the Jews never used that title, you know that? It's never used in the Gospel records except by Gentiles. The only time you ever hear of that title again is when Pilate wrote it on top of the cross. Pilate did. So it's before the child was born and after he was crucified, Gentiles were calling him the King of the Jews, and his own people didn't even know who he was. That's the point that Matthew's making. They didn't know, and didn't understand that. It's incredible, brothers and sisters. It really is incredible that happened. Now, the other thing about that statement in verse 3 that's intriguing is that they were saying this: "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" Born! Now, all right, we read that, and it goes right over our head. Wouldn't have gone over their head. No way would that have gone over their head. You read the history of the time. You just go into the history of the times and see what was happening. Now, here we're told about Herod the king. Where did he get that title from? You know where he got it from? He got it from Rome at great expense of time and money. You see, when you talk about Herod and you talk about Philip and Archelaus and Cassandra and all the others you read about who were the various procurators of the regions of the New Testament, brothers and sisters, it's like talking about what we would understand as state premiers. Mr. Keating, of course, he's Caesar, but the state premiers, that's what we'd be talking about. But you see, what they used to do, they weren't content to be called tetrarchs or ethnarchs or governors or whatever. They would seek to have imposed upon the normal title something grander, and you'd have to do something for that, especially with your pocket. And they would try and do some grand things and pay their way, and it was very, very few of them that were ever called king. None of them were born king, not one. And that would have gone through that city like a bolt of lightning. Born King of the Jews. You remember that startled the Roman governor when Paul said that, he said, "Look, when I bought my Roman citizenship with money," Paul said, "I was free-born." He said, "You what?" And Paul was just talking about Roman citizenship. Now here's one that's born King of the Jews. In other words, his claim would have been above everybody else in that land, in the world. And Herod knew that. But that would have frightened Herod out of his wits. He would have been paranoia plus about that. Do you know Josephus records, brothers and sisters, in his writings of the Antiquities of the Jews, he records that Herod delighted to be known as the King of the Jews. And he bought that at great expense and time. And here's the threat of one that was born like that. Wow. Well, where's the authority? Would that come from? Well, Herod would draw out his papers that signed by the Caesar, by the head of the Roman Empire. He'd drag it out. So look at it, signed. And they said, "Well, where's the sign of this one?" They said, "In the heavens above. Written up there. We've come to see for his star. We've seen his star in the east. And we've come to worship him." You see, these are not funny little Sunday school stories. The whole of that city would have been gripped with the drama of this. Now we know that because, you know, it says later on that not only was Herod perturbed, but all Jerusalem with him. Verse 3, when Herod the king heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. You know why they were troubled? Because they knew a reaction was going to come. Everyone would say, "Oh, look out, look out." They knew the reaction was going to come because they knew what this chapter's like. Do you know what he did, brothers and sisters, Herod did? 5 days before he died, he had his favourite son put to death. 5 days before he died, along with a lot of other nobility of the city, because he wanted the people to be genuinely in mourning. He knew they wouldn't mourn him, so he put them to death 5 days before he died to ensure that they'd mourn for him. Everybody was troubled. They knew there was going to be a reaction from that fellow. The whole of Jerusalem's on tenterhooks about this. A king of the Jews, born king of the Jews, from heaven. His star is in heaven, appointed not by the Caesar but by God. There's trouble brewing, brothers and sisters. There's really trouble brewing. Now what about this star? Well, Daniel chapter 8 and verse 10, we're not going to turn a lot of these references, some we will, some we won't, but Daniel chapter 8 and verse 10 tells us that a star is a symbol of a prince. Because it speaks in symbolic language there of the Roman fourth beast would tread upon the stars and overturn the kingdom of Judea. And it talked about the stars were stamped on the ground, and they were the princes of Judea. Well, that's right, isn't it? He's born to be king, he's a prince. And that's what they've come to see. But it was one of the children of the east that prophesied about that star. Numbers 24, isn't it? Balaam, in Numbers 24, prophesied about that star. Look what he said. In Numbers 24 and verse 17. Here's Balaam, who'd come out of the east country. And in Numbers 24 and verse 17, in one of his wonderful prophecies, he said, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not just for the moment, he said. It's all future. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a king shall rise out of Israel. Scepter, you see, the symbol of a king. What's he going to do? Well, he's going to smite the corners of Moab and destroy all the children of Shem. And Edom shall be a possession. That would interest Herod, wouldn't it? Where else was the prophecy of the star but here? And what's he going to do? He's going to get rid of the Gentile opponents of the people, including the Edomites. Herod was an Edomite, you know that? He was an Idumean. He had a mixture of Jewish blood in him, but he was basically an Edomite. And this star that's going to come out of Jacob is going to dispossess him. That's what this man from the east had said. And we read in verse 19, out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion, and shall destroy him that remaineth in the city. See? And that's obviously the prophecy they're referring to. So the star's going to come out of Jacob, and the children of Edom are going to be destroyed and dispossessed. And this fellow's going to have dominion. Imagine Herod hearing all this. Imagine that. You know, brothers and sisters, do you know why it was that Pilate stuck up for the Lord in the end and would have him delivered? Do you know why that was? Very interesting. Because Jesus gave Pilate an unequivocal assurance that he wouldn't seek his kingdom. That's why it was. And when he did that, Pilate relaxed and stuck up from the Lord ever since. He said, are you a king? He said, I was born to be king. But he went on to say this, Pilate, my kingdom is not of this order of things. Oh, Pilate would have went, whew, relief. My kingdom is not of this world, else would my servants fight. That from that moment onwards, Pilate sought to get him off, because he was assured that he wasn't seeking his position. Herod had no such assurance. All Herod would know from that prophecy, brothers and sisters, that this one would dispossess the children of Edom. And so there's disaster brewing here, because Herod, as I say, is not going to stand idly by and see that happen. It's also interesting, brothers and sisters, about this star. You know, it is related, you know, to the promises made to David. You look in Genesis 22, or rather Revelation 22. And it's rather interesting that the prophecy of the star is related to the promises to David. In the 22nd chapter of Genesis, and we had a look at this last time in our first class together. Revelation 22 verse 16, I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the ecclesias. I am the root, remember that? One who came before David, and the offspring of David, that is, David's fleshly descendant. but Son of God, and the bright and the morning star. It's all together there. And when the apostle was talking about the priesthood of the Lord Jesus Christ superseding that of the law in Hebrews chapter 7, he said that the Lord came from Judah. He said, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. But when he said that, Paul put it this way, he sprang out of Judah. He sprang out of Judah. And the word in the Greek is Anatolia. Anatolia. He, like the sun's rising out of Judah, he said. So he's like the sun or the bright of the morning star, whatever symbol you'd like to take. And it was David who used that wonderful expression as a glossary to his promises, didn't he? That he shall be like a morning without clouds, clear shining after rain. And David saw his promises like that, brothers and sisters, like the morning after the electrifying storm and the oppressive heat of the night before and all the prickly humidity and the perspiration, and then the burst of thunder and the lightning, the flash of the lightning and the pouring rain, and the next morning the wonderful breeze blowing the last of the fluffy white clouds away and the pristine clear air. He said, that's what my promises are going to be like, the bright and the morning star. He sprang out of Judah. And these wise men had come from the east because they'd seen that star that was the symbol of all these things, and had come to worship him, who was born King of the Jews. And John says concerning his own people, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. If you translated that according to the original Greek from John chapter 1, it'd read like this. He came to his own house and found squatters in there who didn't own him. He came to his own house that he owned by God's appointment and found people living in there that didn't even know him. But here are these Gentiles who's following his star to come to worship him. You come with me to Isaiah 60, brothers and sisters. Look at this. Isaiah 60, of course, is the next one on from Isaiah 59, isn't it? And Isaiah 59 speaks about the time in verse 20 when the Redeemer shall come to Zion and turn from transgression in Jacob. Or as Paul puts it in Hebrews 11, turn away ungodliness from Jacob. And so Isaiah 59 sees Jacob in a state of ungodliness. But chapter 60 says, arise and shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of Yahweh is risen upon thee. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the people. And he's talking about not all the people of the world only, but specifically the Jewish people. But Yahweh shall arise upon thee, and his glory shall be seen upon thee, and the Gentiles shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. Lift up thine eyes around about and see, and all they gather themselves together. They come to thee, thy son shall come from far, and thy daughter shall be nursed at thy side. Then thou shalt see and flow together, and thine heart shall fear and be enlarged, because of the abundance of the sea shall be converted unto thee. The forces or the wealth of the Gentiles shall come unto thee. The multitude of camels shall cover thee. The dromedaries of Midian and Ephah, all they from Sheba, children of the east, shall bring gold, incense. You've only got to add myrrh. And they shall show forth the praises of Yahweh. Now that prophecy, brothers and sisters, won't be absolutely fulfilled until Christ comes, will it? And the King will appear in Jerusalem along with his saints. And there'll be Australians among that group. And the Jews are going to say, who is this Lord of glory? And we will tell the Jews who he is. We'll say, he's your king. You don't know him, but we do. And he will be embellished in that day with gifts, won't he? Well, they should have seen that when they saw the dromedaries of Midian turn up, didn't they? And they had their gold and they had their incense and their myrrh, didn't they? When Jacob was in a state of ungodliness. And although that prophecy, I say, will have its ultimate fulfillment at the coming of our Lord, surely, brothers and sisters, you would have thought that somebody would have thought, hey, wait a minute, what's all going on here? And Gentiles had come to worship the King of the Jews. Why? Wouldn't you ask the question, Even if these people, you thought they were mistaken, even if you said, oh, look, you have to be mistaken, surely you would ask yourself the question, why would Gentiles want to worship the King of the Jews? Wouldn't you ask that question? Wouldn't you say to them, hey, we don't believe there's anyone been born King of the Jews, but why would you want to worship the King of the Jews? If they had have asked that question, they might have got the answer which could have led them to a lot of truths, brothers and sisters, concerning the Lord Jesus Christ. Because those men didn't come in ignorance to worship the King of the Jews. Nobody makes that sort of a journey and brings those sort of gifts because just on a whim and a fancy. These people knew what they were doing. So when we come back to Matthew's Gospel again, we read on in our record here. This is a very interesting record. Herod's troubled in verse 3, and so, of course, we understand why. And verse 4, he gathers together the chief priests, the scribes, and the people, and he demands of them where Christ should be born. And there's no mystery to them where he would be born. They know the prophecies, and they said, well, it's Bethlehem, in verse 5. Bethlehem of Judea. For thus it is written in the prophets, and they quote Micah. Micah said that in the land of Judah, thou was least among the princes of Judah, that out of thee shall come governor, that shall rule my people Israel. And Micah added the little point, by the way, whose goings forth have been of old from everlasting. Which translated in the English doesn't really give the sense. But the word going forth, brothers and sisters, literally means an evacuation of the bowels. He who come out of the bowels way back. So Micah was prophesying not only that there would be one come born in Bethlehem, in Judea, who would be born King of the Jews, but really his birth went way back. It was in the mind and purpose of God way back. Whose coming out of the bowels, he said, was way back. So Micah said a whole lot more than what they were aware of here. But they knew at least that Micah had said that out of Bethlehem he would come. Now it's a funny thing that when he actually was born and grew up among them and claimed to be the King of the Jews and to be the Son of God, and they envied him and hated him, when there came a time among the people, there was a division among the people whether he was the Messiah or not. They said he can't be the Messiah. He come out of Galilee. And it says in Micah that he'd come from Bethlehem. That's in John chapter 7. So 30 odd years later, the prophecy gets quoted again to prove that he couldn't be the Messiah. But here it's quoted correctly that Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Wouldn't you think they'd just checked that the records were scrupulously kept? We know that because of the taxation of Mary and Joseph. They were on record. Anyone could have checked where he was born, but nobody wanted to check, did they? 30 years later, that prophecy was quoted here and later on quoted elsewhere for the opposite reason. That's how men twist the Bible, isn't it? Well, verse 7 says, then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. So he knows the place, so he writes that down in his little notebook, and he just wants to know now the time. And he does this in secret. It's confidentially, you see. Of course it would be. You see, imagine Herod if he'd done that publicly. I mean, for all was said about him, he wasn't a maniac. He wasn't bereft of all his senses, in some ways anyway. And he would know that if you make a big public thing of this, you give credence to the story, don't you? People might believe it if you make a fuss about it. So he calls them aside quietly. Not only that, but he's got a plan. And he don't want those people to know, the parents of that child, to know what that plan is. Because if they know that plan, then it won't be able to be fulfilled. So he's got good reasons to have that thing kept private. He wants to know what time that star appeared. Now, when did it appear? Well, they saw it in the east. Now, you think about it. Joseph and Mary would hardly have delayed, brethren and sisters, after the massacre of those children in Bethlehem, to take Jesus into the temple and dedicate him after a period of 40 days. For Mary had a period of 40 days in which she was purified before she could dedicate that child. Being a man-child. Had it been a girl, of course, he would have been 80, but it was a boy, and she had 40 days purification before she could dedicate him in that temple. Now, it's not credible that that would have happened after the massacre of the innocents. They wouldn't have dilly-dallied around for that period of time with that sort of thing hanging over their head. So it's clearly obvious that all that had happened before. This was after Jesus had been dedicated in the temple. And it would appear from when you put the things together that the star probably appeared sometime around by his birth. And then if you take Ezra chapter 7, for Ezra's journey from Babylon to the land was a period of about 4 months. So it would appear, therefore, that Jesus is getting on to 4 or 5 months of age at this time, where he would have been dedicated, of course, in the temple at a different time before that. So Herod knows now about the time, and he knows the place. And he's going to tell a lie. He says in verse 8 that, look, he says, you go and find this child and come again, bring me word that I may come and worship him. You know, brothers and sisters, there was no way those wise men could have been expected to know that was a lie. They couldn't have been expected to know that. Could they? They'd have to take Herod at his word. And he would, of course, would put on a pretty good show, and they would be impressed with this. They would thought, we're impressed. He's obviously impressed. And this boy is a wonder. He's going to be king of the Jews, king of the world. Herod is going to do him honour. Why wouldn't they want to come back and tell Herod? They would have gone off with every intention. But verse 9 says, when they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star, which they saw in the east, went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. So the star reappears. Now you ask yourself the question, why didn't the star, why didn't they go to Bethlehem? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? That when that star appeared in the heavens, in the east, and through some understanding that they had of the signs, and in Genesis chapter 1 it said that the sun, moon and stars were given for signs and for seasons. And these people being educated by Daniel and knowing the prophecies of Balaam and so forth, that the king of Israel would come, where would they associate the king? Wouldn't they associate with Jerusalem? Of course they would. They would head straight for the capital city, wouldn't they? They didn't go to Bethlehem. They had not yet come to that knowledge. But they go straight to the capital, because that's where a king sits on his throne. He's not there. And now they hear the wise men saying, well, he's going to be in Bethlehem. And as they went to Bethlehem on the basis of what the wise men had said, that is the wise men of Israel, the scribes and the chief priests and the Pharisees had said that, and they knew that prophecy, they're heading to Bethlehem, and lo, the star is there, as if saying, yeah, that's right, come this way. And leads them, brethren and sisters, just like the pillar of cloud led Israel, didn't it? Led them, went before them. It says, it went before them, exact language of Exodus 13. The pillar of fire went before them. Not Jews are being led now, but Gentiles. And verse 10 says, and when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. Luke's record of the birth of that child was that when he was born, it says, this shall be joy to all people. Well, he's right. Here they are, representatives of the Gentiles. They go into the house, it says, verse 11. So he's no longer in a manger. You know, you see the stories of the Nativity. Jesus in a manger and the donkey there chewing the straw, and the mother and the child and the 3 wise men. It doesn't say there were 3. And they weren't there when the manger was there. This is long after that. Mary and Joseph had been in Jerusalem. They dedicated that child. And she was purified and made her offering after her 40 days. They had returned and they were in a house. So all those pictures you see are nonsense. They're in a house now. This is where the wise men find that child. And they bring him gifts, it says. Gifts in verse 11. Interesting word, brothers and sisters, this word gifts. It's a Greek word, doron, which means a present or a gift. But it's generally used in the sense of a positive gift. You know, you get in Hebrews chapter 4 and 5 about, we have a great high priest, Jesus, the Son of God, says the apostle. And then he talks about the need we have of a high priest who can have compassion on the ignorant and them that are out of the way, he says, and who can offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. So sacrifices for sin are negative, for which we've got Jesus. And positive gifts to God, which need to be put at God's feet in heaven above. For that reason we've got the Son of God. So that the idea of the word gifts is very often in the sense of a positive gift. And that's what these men brought. And I think negative in what they brought, they were full of joy, and everything that was positive was going to happen. The only thing, brothers and sisters, that they could not have known at this point of history was that they were giving gifts to the greatest gift that was ever given to men. Because in John chapter 4, Jesus said to the woman of Samaria, if you knew the Doron, the gift of God, you would ask him of water, and he would give you living water to drink. He was in the real sense, brothers and sisters, a greater gift than what anyone could ever give him. They were not to know that, but they were honouring him with their positive gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Much has been said about the significance of those three elements. Well, what is the significance? Well, there's a lot of significance, I believe, in them, but we, for the sake of our class and reducing it down, probably in a nutshell, what will we say? Well, you see, we won't quote these references, but in Psalm 45, Psalm 72, those gifts are mentioned as being fit for a king. So they ought to, because gold's the chief metal, frankincense is the chief ingredient in the incense, and myrrh is number one ingredient in the holy anointing oil. So they are the chief ingredients. They are themselves king gifts. Gold, the most precious, frankincense, the leading element in the incense, and myrrh, the leading liquid in the anointing oil. They are the kings of those things. Not only that, brothers and sisters, they're all associated with the high priest. Look, it's so fitting that these gifts should be given. The high priest had a golden plate on his forehead, didn't he? And he went into the holy place, brothers and sisters, with the incense of prayer, of which frankincense was the chief ingredient. And he couldn't do that unless he was anointed with the holy anointing oil, of which the myrrh was the chief ingredient. So we haven't only got a king here, we've got a priest. And do you know why it is that it's so intriguing? Have you ever thought about what it is about this king priesthood? Well, what's the whole secret of that? We always talk about kings and priests. How many brothers and sisters know the relationship and why that is? It's like this. What do we say the purpose of God with the earth is? Isn't it that God might manifest himself among men and women and glorify himself in a multitude of people? Isn't that the quintessence of God's purpose? Of course it is. That's his purpose, isn't it? Well, what is God's character made up of? Well, his character is twofold, basically. He's just and merciful, isn't he? So when people are given immortality, they're going to be made king priest. Why? Because he that ruleth over men must be just, says 2 Samuel 23. But of a priest, we read, he's got to have compassion on the ignorant. And no one ever got that together perfectly, did they? In our readings the other night, we learnt that we can get them together. They are compatible because they actually kiss. Mercy and truth will kiss, have kissed. But we can't get them to kiss because we mix them up. We get them wrong. And we'll always get them wrong this side of the kingdom. But somebody got them right. When the Lord came, he was a perfect balance between mercy and justice. He's a king priest, so they gave him gold, frankincense, myrrh, kingly gifts, all of them associated with the high priest. It was a wonderful gift to give him, brothers and sisters. There's no doubt about that. And then God warned them not to go back to Herod. Of course he did. Because that's where they would have gone, naturally. Because they would have thought, well, they would have done him an honour by going back to Herod and telling Herod about him and getting the king to worship him. But God says, no, he's a lie. Don't you go back there. And so he warned them, and they went back another way into their own land. And then he appears to Joseph in verse 13 and warns Joseph to get out of the land, brothers and sisters, for the safety of that child. Now I want you to notice something in verse 13. It says, and when they were departing, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise and take the young child and his mother. Now if you colour in that expression, you'll find it's used 5 times in this record. Verse 11, they saw the young child with Mary. I've just read the one from verse 13. Verse 14, when he arose and took the young child and his mother. And you've got it again in verse 20, saying, "Arise and take the young child and his mother." And then you've got it in verse 21, "And he arose and took the young child and his mother." 5 times. We all know what 5 is significant of. I'm not a great one on the sort of fanatic on Bible numerics, brothers and sisters. I think sometimes that gets a bit ridiculous. But I tell you what, 5 is everywhere the number of grace. It is everywhere the number of grace. And you know, in a psalm which talked about the agony of our Lord Jesus Christ, how that men would take him and brutally put him to death and nail him to a stake and part his garments and pierce his hands and his feet. In that psalm it says, "You made me hope upon my mother's breasts." But how could a baby hope? He was incapable at that stage of exercising that principle, brothers and sisters. But you see, the Hebrew has the sense, as the RSV puts it, "You kept me safe on my mother's breast. You kept me safe." The young child and his mother, 5 times. Here's a classic example of that. The young child and his mother. And so, of course, he was kept safe when he was powerless, of course, to do anything about his own safety. Well, verse 15 tells us that when Herod was dead, they come up out of Egypt. And Matthew, as ever his way, brothers and sisters, he sees a fulfilment of a prophecy, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, that's Hosea, saying, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." Now I'd like you to have a look at that. You know, people say, how on earth could Matthew see a prophecy in that? Of the Lord Jesus Christ, that is. Surely this is concerning Israel. Well, it is. But you listen. He's quoting Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, where it says, "When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt." Now, you know the record when Moses went before Pharaoh. We read that not many moons ago. And Yahweh said in Exodus 4 and verse 22 concerning Israel, he said, "Go and tell Pharaoh, let my son go, my firstborn son." So he was the firstborn of Yahweh, nationally speaking. As a nation, God had taken Israel to himself. No other nation had been taken like that. So he was the firstborn national son of God. And out of Egypt he came. But that's concerning Israel. How does Matthew see in that a prophecy of the Lord? Well, you look at verse 2. "As they called them, so they went from him." That's rather ambiguous, isn't it? What does that mean? Well, the RSV puts it better. "The more I called them, the more they went from me." See? So he called them out of Egypt. But the more he called them, the more they wouldn't come. They wouldn't do the right thing. Now what Matthew was saying, brothers and sisters, that where the national son has failed, here comes the real son. Now you watch him. Will the more God call him prove that he won't be obedient, or will it be otherwise? Now you think, hey, this is terrific. Now you listen. You follow this through. When we come to the temptation, I want to show you something about this. It's incredible the way that Matthew presents this. How that Jesus becomes, as it were, the Son of God, the real Son of God, the individual, not the national Son, to do the opposite to what that national Son did. Now we won't turn all these references up, but you listen. Deuteronomy 8 said, that in the 8th chapter of Deuteronomy, Moses said to Israel, he said, "God led thee into the wilderness," in verse 2. And in verse 5, he mentions the fact that as a father with his son, he did that. So, Yahweh led Israel into the wilderness to demonstrate that he was the father of that nation and they were his sons. And Matthew says that he was led of the Spirit into the wilderness. What for? If you be the Son of God. So here he comes. They were led by the Spirit into the wilderness to prove they were the sons of God, and they didn't believe it. And they proved they were not the sons of God. And there's more in it than that when we come to the temptation. But here comes the Son of God, led into the Spirit, by the Spirit into the wilderness, and he was proven to be the Son of God. See what Matthew's trying to tell us? And Paul goes on, picks that up, in Romans 8 and verse 14, and he says this, "For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God." There it all is. And so when Matthew sees him come up out of Egypt, He's not saying that Hosea 11 and verse 1 is a direct reference to the Lord in that sense. What he's saying is that this is what God was doing with his national son, but the more he called them, the more they went astray. Now watch he do with this one. Now you watch this one when he comes up out of Egypt. And then along comes, in the couple of chapters on, the temptation in the wilderness, which he records so magnificently to demonstrate that he is the real Son of God. So it all has a relevance, brothers and sisters, a very great relevance. Now we better move on a bit in Matthew chapter 2. A couple of things we want to mention here before we conclude. We've got the slaughter of these babies from verses 16 to 18. 2 years and under. Herod wasn't taking any chances, was he? Verse 16 says when he thought he was mocked of the wise men, he was exceeding wrath, which was typical of him. And of course he orders all these children to be slain from 2 years and up and under. And he didn't take any chances whatever. Now it's been estimated, brothers and sisters, for any of the sisters who may, and the sisters in particular get very distressed about this, has been estimated that the population of Bethlehem at that time would probably be about 2,000, and per average of that population, no more than about 20 boys, I suppose. That's enough. But there would have been about 20 young lads who would have been put to sword on that occasion. Matthew sees another prophecy, remarkably. Verse 17. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah, saying, In Ramah was a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and would not be comforted because they are not. Now, there's a big difficulty here, because these children were slaughtered in Bethlehem. Jerusalem's there. Bethlehem is about 5 miles down there. Ramah is 5 miles there, north, about the same distance north as Bethlehem is south. And so Jeremiah can't be talking about Rachel dying in birth when she was given birth to Benjamin just a little way outside of Bethlehem. Because when she was mourning, then she died, not her child. He lived. It's the reverse, isn't it? But you see what Matthew's saying? See what Jeremiah is saying? See, Jeremiah was in Ramah. What happened? Now, we won't turn this up. But what happened was that when Rabshakeh and the others took the captives from Jerusalem, they took them north and they took Ramah as a rallying point. Jeremiah says that in his 31st chapter in verse 15, or chapter 40 rather, in verse 1. They were assembled at Ramah. So that here is the Babylonians ready to take people into captivity. And they're bringing them all together to Ramah and forging the chains around their ankles. And separating husband and wife and children and dragging them off into captivity. It was all happening in Ramah like herding cattle there. What a terrible scene that would have been, brothers and sisters. And Jeremiah was there waiting to see what was going to happen to him too. And he'd see that scene. All these Jewish people gathered in Ramah, people breaking their heart, and women clutching their babies as the Babylonians would wrench them and kill them. Of course they would. Who wants to take a baby to Babylon? Only a nuisance. We've got a long way to go. We're just concerned about captives. And there'd be the slaughter of a whole lot of children in Ramah. And Jeremiah stands off and he sees the ground awash with tears of mothers and fathers for the children. And his mind goes to Rachel. And he sees the nation as like the mother of the nation. She was one of the matriarchs of the nation, out of whom that nation came. And Jeremiah wasn't saying that it was an absolute fulfillment, because she mourned her own death. Her child lived. And she was 5 miles south of Jerusalem. They're 5 miles north. It's all the other way around. But nonetheless, Jeremiah remembers that pathetic scene of that woman giving vent to her feelings when she lost her life in the birth of the Son of God's right hand. And now, here they go into captivity. Brothers and sisters, heaven wept, didn't they? When they hung him on the cross, the Son of God's right hand. And that morning was terrible. The heavens were made dark, weren't they? And the few people who understood what was going on, like the women who were first of all standing afar off because they didn't want to see a naked man like that, and add to his shame, were inexorably drawn to the foot of his cross. And his last instructions were given concerning his mother's welfare, and so on. And there would have been broken hearts there for the death of this son of God's right hand who lived back in the days of Rachel. But it wasn't many years, was it, before the Romans got them all together, didn't they? And dragged them out of that city and crucified 750,000 of them around the city, and then drew the rest off and dragged them into captivity. It was all reenacted again. Matthew can see that. And he sees Rachel weeping south of Bethlehem. He looks at Jeremiah and he sees Jeremiah standing there looking at this crowd of people, breaking their heart. And Jeremiah himself, as he said in lamentation, washed in tears. Sees the children brutally slaughtered by the Babylonians as only being bits of baggage to be got rid of before they left the city. And he sees these people breaking their heart. He remembers the anguish of Rachel. And here is now Matthew. It's in Bethlehem now. He's not at Ramah. Jeremiah's prophecy take another turn. He's back south again, and he's in the very region where Rachel lost her life in the agony of childbirth. Tremendous thing, you know, when you think about the way that these prophets, Jeremiah and now Matthew, is able to see the poignancy of those references in the Bible. Well, he comes out of Egypt at the end of this chapter, brothers and sisters. Archelaus, we read in verse 22, one of Herod's sons was made the king rather in the room of his father Herod. And he wasn't actually made king. He wasn't even made tetrarch. He only got the title of ethnarch, just a bit below that. He didn't rate very high with Rome, so he didn't become a king on the death of his father. He was just like his father. You know what he did? He hadn't hardly been installed on that throne, brothers and sisters, than at the very first Passover that the Jews kept. In his reign, he slaughtered 3,000 of them to prove who was boss. He got dragged off into exile because the Romans knew that he was only going to make a mess of the whole show. But because Mary and Joseph would know, of course, in a dream, they were warned not to go near him, they went into Nazareth. And Matthew again. He says he went into Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, plural. He shall be called a Nazarene. Now, where does it say that? Well, it doesn't. There's no expression, he shall be called a Nazarene. And Matthew doesn't say that one prophet said that. He said prophets said that. Now, the word Nazareth comes from a Hebrew word, netzer, which means a green shoot. A green shoot. And it's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah who says it's the man's name who is the branch. Hebrew, a green shoot. So it is in the prophets. It's this green shoot that he might be called a Nazarene. And how does Matthew chapter 2 finish? There shall come forth a shoot out of the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. But it's almost as if Matthew is saying that God brought that child out of Egypt like a little tender plant. Isaiah 53. He shall grow up as a tender plant in a dry ground, says Isaiah. And all the story is being told of the sterility and the aridness of that country, spiritually speaking. But out of Egypt he called his son. Like Psalm 80 says, he brought a vine out of Egypt and planted it in the land. And he became a green shoot, brothers and sisters. And when they took him to the cross, he said to the crowd about him, he said, if they do this in a green tree, what do you think they're going to do in a dry? So there he was. And they should be called a Nazarene. And so the promises to David get another mention at the end of chapter 2. And next time we come back, brothers and sisters, God willing, we will see him as a grown-up man and we will consider the temptation.